Welcome again to the Comic Book Historians Podcast with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson. Today we have a special guest, Michael Dooley. Michael is a professor at ArtCenter College of Design, where he teaches design, history of comics, and animation. Beginning in 1991, Michael was a contributing editor for the graphic design magazine Print. Prior to that, he wrote for Amazing Heroes and the Comics Journal. He directed programming and hosted events for the Masters of American Comics exhibit in Los Angeles in 2005, and co-edited one of the essential books on comic studies, The Education of a Comic Artist. Education of a Comic Artist brings together many stars in comic history to discuss their viewpoint, even their corner of the vast multi-dimensionalism of comic books. It's a great intro for people to realize that comics come in many forms, from editorial, strips, books, novels, production to design to art to writing to editing in various genres, etc. Michael Dooley, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here with you two.
What we always do with the podcast, Michael, which you probably already know, is that because you're a good listener. I know that.
Did you say something?
Actually, you listen to our podcast, actually, yes. In your spare time.
In my spare time. Yeah, and I can go on record as saying that Comic Book Historians is absolutely my favorite podcast for many reasons.
Oh, that's
so,
awesome.
Yes.
Well, we appreciate that very much.
I know you were born in New York. I know you went to Pratt. I know you moved to LA at some point, but give us a little more detail about all of those things.
Let's see. At some point means 1974. That's when I traveled cross country in a Tercel and settled in the LA area. So in 75, I started going to San Diego Comic-Con. Earlier than that, flashback to me being 2 years old. That's when I started reading comics. I know that's a comic historian podcast question. So at age 2, I was looking at and eventually reading comics. And at age 7, I fell in love with Harvey Kurtzman because I bought one of his Mad comics. So that's it in a nutshell in terms of getting my early start in comics.
And the important part of that is it introduced you to comedic social criticism. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, definitely. And it pretty much was extremely formative in my life. Just to get personal for a quick bit, when I was 7 years old, that my mother and father got divorced. My dad left. So actually, Harvey was my surrogate father to a large extent in terms of forming my sensibility, for which I'm forever grateful. So,
and this was through your reading his work, right? That's through
the comic. It's picking up. Comic. Yeah, it's picking up Mad number. Is it 22? It was the one where they did the Johnson and Smith ad parody on the cover, and the first story was Popeye, and it was one of those things that was such a quantum leap from Little Lotta and Baby Huey and the rest of it. In its way, it's like how Art Spiegelman and Bob Crumb talk about the Basil Wolverton Mad being formative, mind-blowing experience. And for me, that was that. It was just, I spent the longest time reading that cover over and over and just fascinated that. Yeah, it was one of those things where, because it was so meta from the very beginning, it's like, okay, I've seen these ads inside the comic, and here it is in front, only it's not really, and which actually made me start to realize something. Oh, there are actually people there's a sensibility behind this. And it's like, okay, somebody's writing this, somebody's drawing this. It's not just coming off the presses because somebody pressed a button. So it was really formative in that way, in the sense that it piqued my interest in graphic design before I knew what the word graphic design meant.
It's a crafted art form by people.
Right. Yeah. Now I are one, as they say.
So, Michael, were you aware of like the name Kurtzman? Were you able to like see like, oh, that's Will Elder, that's Kurtzman, that's John Severin? I mean, were you noticing the different styles at that point?
From the first issue, I was noticing, because there was each one of them had such a distinctive. There was Wally Woods on the waterfront, and Elder did the Popeye, and then there was Jack Davis in there as well. They were so distinctive that was part of that whole visual education that I was getting at that tender age. And then, of course, old Harv was nice enough to put out the History of Will Elder comic.
Oh, yeah.
That definitely makes it more convenient. Sure.
Yeah. Old Harv was really coming along at the right time all over the place there. And so, as you can see, I'm gushing with admiration. Yeah, he was my first superhero.
That awesome. Will Elder piece is so sophisticated. I mean, like, if you think that they're writing for 10-year-olds, it's impossible to reconcile that with that whole comic bit. That was just so brilliant.
Yeah, that the fact that Popeye is running into Tarzan and Mammy Yokum and Super Duper Man and the rest of it. It was this revelation. I come to think of it, I don't know if I've ever spent that long looking at a 32-page comic, that sort of thing. And, and of course, the eyeball kicks that he put in as well. So, yeah, that was definitely a revelation.
Were you aware that they were also working in other genres in EC's line of comics, or were you just interested in the humor stuff at this point?
At this point, I just knew about the humor stuff. Later on, I became familiar with the entire EC line. But at that point, at the tender age of 7, I wasn't particularly tuned into Ghastly and the rest of them. So right. I was happy to do that, and then there were the Get Lost, Andrew and Esposito, and the rest of them Panic out of Feldstein's factory. So that was what got me by for a while. Yeah.
Did Two-Fisted Tales, Frontline Combat, did those affect you in any way?
Oh, yeah, I would definitely say so, in the sense that it was, again, part of that whole underground scene that came along. I was, I believe I'm the same age as Spiegelman. It was one of those things where Harvey went on with Trump and Humbug and Help. So after Mad changed, I was that well aware to start looking around for his other stuff, which of course led me back into comics like Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat.
So it was more retroactively you went back to that stuff.
Yeah. And they were the first, because I was still fairly young at the time. So, by the time I was involved in Vietnam War protests, I had already had that whole sensibility formed again from whatever Dad the Second.
So did Pfeiffer become your next big hero, or were there ones in between?
Wow, you are so shrewd, Jim. There was the Village Voice that came along, and so in the late 50s, I started tuning into Pfeiffer in the front of the newspaper, and eventually got around to Paul Krassner's Realist, the rest of it, and that sort of thing. But yeah, the Pfeiffer newspaper comics. But before then, there were Pfeiffer was there's a special feature in the Village Voice. Right. But in terms of newspaper comic strips, I was super addicted to that, also from a fairly early age. So that was mind expanding in that way. That was pretty much my introduction to the various other genres. So it's like when I was reading Popeye, I was already aware that it's like Little Abner was on the front page of one of the newspapers. There were about 5 Sunday newspaper supplements that were comics in New York at the time. Luckily, every Sunday I would go over to my mom's mother. My grandmother would get all the papers. And so my brother and I would just spend the entire visit most of the visit over there, getting familiar with Dick Tracy, was on the cover of another one, and all the other comics. So that was also supplementing my education. Right. And back then it was pretty much, I would read like every single comic indiscriminately from beginning to end. I had my favorites, but yeah, newspaper comic strips. Yeah, imagine that. That's how old I am. That I can talk about being able to spend an hour or two with Sunday comic supplements.
Right, that's right. And you mentioned the Paul Krassner's Realist, just for the audience. That was from 1958, and you discovered that in 65 when you were at Pratt studying design, I think, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I listened to you. Yeah.
What what made you go to Pratt? Like at some point, did you say, I want to be a comic book artist? At some point, did you say, I just want to go into design? What was your artistic trajectory at this point?
Okay, great question. Thanks. I just to maybe even wrap up or do a transition here from Kurtzman. We were talking about the newspaper comics, and one of my absolute favorite newspaper comics among those in the 1950s, one that I went to first was Smokey Stover. I realize in retrospect that those eyeball kicks that Will Elder was providing was actually, the groundwork was laid by Bill Holman. And yeah, I'm so thrilled about the Screwball book that came out this past year. So so the comics were definitely part of it. And one of the things about going over to my grandmother's to read the comics was it was a gathering place for all of my mom's relatives. And she had several sisters and brothers. It's a Catholic family. And so, and they brought their kids as well. So I got to hang out on those Sundays with my cousin, my mother's sister's son, one of her sons, named Steve Degnan, and he was going to Pratt. At the time, I was going to Holy Cross High School in Queens, and he was talking about Pratt Institute. And I really started thinking along the lines of that even more seriously when, if I can just do this real quick, a little incident that happened in high school was there were brothers and lay teachers there. So I learned, I took Latin, that sort of thing. But there was this one teacher who was very physical. It's like early 1960s. There was no problem with, even before that in the 50s, going to Catholic grade school, no problem with the nuns beating shit out of you. But it happened even with the brothers and the lay teachers in high school. And so one time I was in, I think it was a geography class, and it was, I never saw the sense of geography. And this is even before GPS, it's like now nobody needs to know that, unless they really care about the principal export of Ecuador. And so I was doodling in my notebook instead of taking notes. And the teacher was realizing just from the way my hand was moving that, that I was not hanging on to his every word. And so he came down and he looked at these cartoons I was drawing because, again, it was that influence from reading the Sunday funnies and whatnot. And I thought for sure I was just about to get my head smashed into a wall. But instead, what he did was he picked up my notebook, went to the front of the class, held it up to the rest of the class, and he said, Mr. Dooley is very lucky. Some people go through their entire lives without knowing what they want to do. And Mr. Dooley has already found art as his calling. And I went, oh, really? But then it was just something clicked. That was the turning point. And then after that, I started asking Steve more and more questions about what's this going on around with Pratt. And so 1965 to 70, I was in Pratt. Steve had graduated from Pratt with an industrial design degree, and he was hired right out of school by Ford. They took him to Detroit, the rest of it, that sort of thing. And he was designing cars. And of course, being a teenager in the late 1960s was, of course, transformative. So even though I was on an industrial design track, at that time, I was finding out all sorts of other things, in addition to countercultural comics and the rest. It was also reading Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader before he became a presidential election spoiler, back when he was a consumer advocate. And I was like, this is the kind of crap that's going on with the Pinto and the rest. And so the whole idea of working in industrial design, working for those kind of corporations that I was protesting as part of my rebellious Pratt years. So anyway, long short is I decided I wasn't going to be part of industry. Actually, my first job out of school was as a photographer because I was doing freelance photography to pay my rent. I got hired by ABC to go down to photograph the Johnny Cash show after I graduated.
Wow. That's great.
So I did that for a while. And then my career has pinballed. My trajectory has been somewhat curvy, but that's basically the answer to Jim's question.
Boy, I hate to just go into something as much of a trajectory as this, but I can't not do it. Johnny Cash, when you say the Johnny Cash show, Do you mean his limited run on television show, or do you mean his concerts or the prison, which would be the most awesome answer you could give? What do you mean by the
oh, okay.
If you tell me Folsom, I will be happier that I've been in a long time, but I assume that's not what you mean.
No, actually it was I wasn't stuck in Folsom. It was actually San Quentin. And I was there involuntarily. No, the real truth of it is it was ABC TV that hired me in New York, sent me down there basically to do promo work, because instead of an industrial design portfolio, what I wound up with was my portfolio of professional work as a photographer that I was doing, again, as a way of being able to keep myself in apartment rent and food. Yeah, so what I would do, this was 1970. Yeah, he had a show for a couple of years down in Nashville, originally broadcast out of the Grand Ole Opry. And that's where I would photograph, like during the week, during rehearsal. I would shoot the guests and such, and then send the film off to ABC, and they'd use it in their promos for the upcoming show, that sort of thing. So that was that gig.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you got to because that's a very important show in terms of rock and roll, because he brought in a lot of people that were not strictly country. People like, well, Linda Ronstadt walked a line, but he was important to Bob Dylan's history in relation to this too. Were you taking pictures of people like that?
Yeah, there were people, not Dylan specifically, but there were a variety of people coming through at the time. I was, in terms of actors, there was Dennis Hopper. That was
oh, cool.
That was pretty impressive. And God, let's see, it's been so, and it's one of those things too that since I was sending the film to ABC and I was young at the time, I never even thought about getting copies of the photos they use. So I don't really have any. So and I haven't thought about it so long. But yeah, there were some people that impressed me in the long run. It was people like Carl Perkins, who was there pretty regularly, that I was really impressed with. I mean, for me, I was a much bigger Carl Perkins fan than I was Johnny Cash. So he was pretty impressive in that sense. Yeah, various
Alex,
other people.
There's a famous story where June Carter gave Linda Ronstadt $2 and said, "Go across the street to the Five and Dime and buy yourself some panties. Don't come back without them."
Oh, there, I guess, is a story that leads up to that.
I just want to know if you had any photos.
Well,
we could leave it at that and move on.
No, unfortunately, yeah, I love Linda Ronstadt, and I saw a lot of, rock performers, from the Rolling Stones at Madison Square Garden in the late 60s to all sorts of other people. But yeah, Linda Ronstadt is one that I regret not seeing either in concert or at the Opry.
So let's get to how you came to California, and then I want to launch into your book, because that's where we're going to spend a good amount of time. So what made you come to California?
At the time, I was living in the Johnny Cash show, that gig ended, came back, was living in a basement apartment in Jersey City with my then wife and my newborn son. And we decided, Jersey City wasn't the greatest place to be, that whole area. I mean, it's like New York wasn't the greatest place to be in the early 70s, right? We're talking
Son of Sam.
73 was when he was born. Yeah, that was where.
That was a little later, right? Yeah.
What's that? What was later?
Yeah, Son of Sam was a touch later than that, but yeah, 70s.
Yeah. But it was inspiration, the sort of, because New York was going down the toilet, there was that whole Milton Glaser doing the I Heart New York thing, that sort of thing, which didn't fix up New York. It just made people feel better about living in the shithole.
Yes.
So, but I decided, anyway, we packed up pretty young at the time. We came out here. I wasn't working. Chris, our son, was about 9 months old in the car seat.
Oh, wow.
And so we just came out here and looked around for work and managed to land some work. Before that, in Jersey, I was working in a newspaper, and I was a designer by that time. Again, long short, graphic designer doing layouts and such. And I also started writing back then, because this was early 70s, and it's like, it was at a time where if you wrote articles that get published this was a fairly major paper in Woodbridge, New Jersey. And so I started writing album reviews and concerts that I'd go to and sent them off to the record labels. And the next thing I knew, I was getting boxes of albums to me. So, and this was aside from my other job. And then I also was like, they didn't have an illustrator at the time. And so I was still doodling. So they said, oh, could you illustrate some feature stories that were running? And it was like, okay, yeah, I'll do that too, in addition to the writing job that I wasn't getting paid for and my full-time job. Anyway, so I was in newspapers, long, short, coming out here in 1977, got hired at the LA Times. From 77 to 99, I worked as creative director at the LA Times. I ran their creative services department. So
wait, this was from 77 to 99?
Yes. Yeah.
That's a long time. Okay.
That's the longest gig I ever had.
When you were contributing to Amazing Heroes and such, that was during this time that you're also working there.
Right, in the late 80s. The nepotism story there is that my brother was at the time the editor of Amazing Heroes, and and I was talking with him about comics, as we do all the time still, and the subject we were talking about, he was like, hey, you want to write that up for Amazing Heroes? And I was, okay, sure. So that got me back into writing. No free records this time, but, just whatever Fantagraphics managed to scrounge up to pay me for. And started out Amazing Heroes, and then realized that, well, Comics Journal is really where I belong in that situation. So I jumped to there. And then after that, it was print.
We're packed up. We're going to California. Tell us what happens between there and where we want to get eventually, which is you co-editing the education of a comics artist. And that's a long period of time. You're at the LA Times. And what else are you doing?
And he's there. He was there till 1999.
1999.
He also contributed to the Comics Journal and Amazing Heroes. And then now 1999 it ends. And now you're essentially professorial and you're co-editing this book. Tell us what leads to the book.
Or other things that you were doing too. Alex kind of skipped 5 years. I just wanted from 1999 until then. What were you doing also?
Well, actually, just to jump back from the late 80s to print magazine, because that's pretty much the transition, is I got interested in writing for print magazine in the late 80s when they put out a special issue on comics. And I was like, oh, let me propose a pitch here. And basically the pitch was this is 1990. And it was at the time when High and Low, the Kirk Varnedoe show that was high art and popular culture that was including comics on display for the first time, notably. And I said, I want to write about that. That got me hired and got me made a contributing editor. Then in the course of that, I wrote an article about Emigre Magazine, which is a graphic design magazine. And from Emigre Magazine, they got interested in me and they wanted me to do an issue of their magazine, which involved interviewing various people from Cranbrook and CalArts, as well as Steve Heller. So Steve Heller is, just briefly, he's someone who's written, co-edited well over 200 books on graphic design. I got to meet him in the early 90s and got to go to his studio to interview him. We became friends after that, and we still are, I'm very happy to say. He was saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this book, the one that eventually became Education of a Comics Artist, and I'd like a co-editor. I'd like you to be my co-editor.
Nice.
So it was his idea. He took me on board, and I ran with that. So that was, let's see, that book came out in, I guess we have jumped because now it's
2005.
2005.
So when did you guys start working on it? What year was that when you started working on it?
Started working on it 2003.
Okay,
I would say, because it was a long process. We started out with outlining and wish lists of who we wanted to be part of it. The general concept was kind of like a modernization, an update, a book version of the Famous Artists Correspondence School and the draw winky matchbook covers. Basically, it's like, okay, anybody who's been thinking about becoming a comics artist, what do you need to know? Well, it's a lot more complex than anything Norman Rockwell and his gang back in the 50s was able to tell you. So wound up that we were able to get original contributions from well over 60 professionals in various aspects of comics, with that idea of people would pick it up and it would be a sampler kit, really, to be able to flip through it. It was by no means meant to be read cover to cover. So we've got all sorts of aspects of it, as I guess we'll be discussing momentarily.
Yeah, we want to get right into that and dive in, because we want to go through section by section. But let me ask you a question in relation to making it, which is, it does have sections such as the comic business, the comics field, widening the field, education, and were those divided between you, or did each of you work on all of the categories together?
Not evenly divided at all. We worked together on both, and it just happened that, Steve has certain interests, so that was what he concentrated on, and it was pretty much everything else was having me go to town, which I did a lot of. It's like, say, in what I call the action adventure comics, that was all me. It was basically, Steve said, as some people say, is I don't give a shit at all about superheroes. Just you take the superheroes.
You do the superheroes, okay.
Yeah. And I've got a lot of feelings about superheroes, which is why the title wound up action adventure comics.
Right, because it's not like you're totally devoted to superheroes. That would be a misclassification.
Yes. I've never actually done a count, but quite a bit of the book is me. And he was definitely guiding me all along. This was the first time I was co-editing a comic and even a book. And even though most of the comic stuff may have turned out to be mine, it was definitely under his expert supervision. So I'm very grateful for that.
We're going to go through a lot of the sections that will be interesting to our audience. We'll talk about what you learned, who you picked, why you picked them, that kind of thing. But then with each section, if you were doing it today, if you're doing an imaginary new edition, or I would hope an actual new edition, because I think it's definitely called for at this point, who you'd like to see interviewed, what new topics should be explored, what should be maybe changed from what was done originally, and in that answer, talk about the topic, whatever we're discussing within that chapter. The cartoons, the editorial cartoons, the political comics, that kind of stuff that's in that very first section. And then I'll turn it over to Alex to talk about the adventure comics and the adventure strips and all of that. So
before we do that, I want to ask Michael one more thing about your Harvey Kurtzman influence. So you mentioned the Mad Trump Help, which inspired and he worked with people like Gilliam, Steinem, Crumb, Spiegelman, and fostered a whole generation of countercultural comics. But I noticed you left out a long period of his, which was his Little Annie Fanny period that he did for Playboy magazine. Would you consider that basically not real Kurtzman? Would you consider that just kind of a money grab? Is that an embarrassing time of his life? Or would you say that there is something to value in that professional phase of his life? I'm just curious about what you have to say about that.
I don't know to what extent he was embarrassed about it. I know that it helped Kurtzman, the bad businessman, make a whole shitload of money for the rest of his life. And it's one of those things where, there's stuff in there that's interesting, but you really have to dig for it. And I guess it was also one of those times where, so I'd be about in my early teens when he started working there. And I'd say this is one case where he not exactly came along at the right time because, I found myself, of course, picking up Playboy for the articles. But the thing about Little Annie Fanny, it was so weird. It's just, one of those things that, I can't even quite understand the arousal factor there. It's just, she was such this inflatable doll, two-dimensional person that it was pretty much that he lost his real. That's basically what was happening around that time. Was also when I was picking up the realists. So there was the transition there. Right. Yeah, he did 20-something years of Annie Fanny and with Elder. But it was kind of like, for me, the pinnacle of Kurtzman's career, Kurtzman Elder, was Goodman Beaver. So after that, it was just pretty much, again, to get real personal, this was right around the time my mother passed away, and I was pretty much on my own at that point.
Yeah.
And so there was a transition there where pretty much Paul Krassner became my mentor. I was living in New York, as was he at the time. And so the realist became the Bible that the early Kurtzman stuff once was when I was younger. That's basically it in a nutshell, as far as not really caring about Kurtzman, other than to talk about the production values. But,
There you
okay.
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. It was a diluted Kurtzman. It wasn't the same as what it was before. And he was past his peak, essentially, as far as cultural significance and things like that. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, pretty much. But I mean, in the sense that so many people have 50 years where they were doing spectacular stuff, considering late 40s to early 60s, that's like 15 years of dynamite. It still puts him up there in the pantheon for me as God the Father.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
I guess, or actually maybe if I was doing a trinity, maybe Eisner would be God the Father, Kurtzman would be God the Naughty Son, and Pfeiffer would be God the Holy Spirit, not the actual Spirit.
This is a very Catholic trinity description. I like it. Okay, well done.
Yeah, we're there. We're going there.
All right, Jim, go ahead.
Okay, so the first section that covers, it starts with a section on magazine cartoons, then one on editorial cartoons, and then on political comics.
Yep.
In terms of the magazine cartoons and things like the New Yorker, but also a lot of other magazines going back further in time, that's an area of comics history that really does not get nearly enough discussion, in my opinion. And it's significant, I think, that that's where you start. What was your thinking in terms of that? And you have 3 articles in that, 3 writings on it. How did you come to those versus other ones? There's so much you could have chosen from. You did start with the New Yorker, signifying that as significant versus Puck or some other things. What were you thinking in selecting the ones that you picked?
Well, in terms of this being a book that the layperson could easily pick up and appreciate, as well as some of the more in-depth stuff. So it's like, all levels, all ages sort of thing. My thought was that in terms of people who were going to be looking at the cover, reading the title, that sort of thing, probably for the most part, what they're going to be thinking of is the single panel cartoons in a broad sense. You have the geeks and the rest of it, but there's whatever preaching to the choir. So I thought that magazine cartoons was a good place that pretty much everybody is familiar with, and in all its various aspects. And of course, the New Yorker being iconic. So what better person to ask than Bob Mankoff, who at the time was the cartoon editor, a really funny guy in person too. That's where it started. And as I recall, speaking of the devil, Paul Krassner was also one of the people that I got there to talk about the cartoons in the realist. Most famously, your fans would know his Disneyland Memorial Orgy double-page spread that Wally Wood drew on the occasion of Uncle Walt's passing away.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know he did it for Walt Disney's death. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. That was the idea was, okay, actually on the cover of that magazine, there was just Mickey Mouse himself with a sign that said, "God is dead." And so this is pretty much, Paul was able to extrapolate, okay, now that their God is dead, what's going to happen to them? Right. And so, orgy time. And so, while, Woody gets involved.
So if in terms of the magazine cartoons, you don't focus necessarily on an individual so much, but I wondered if you were doing it now. I just bought the Fantagraphics Art Young book, which is just brilliant. Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah, I have that shirt. Oh, I picked it up as soon as it came out. Yeah,
I just love that book. Are there artists of that earlier period that you'd like to discuss in that magazine cartoon section? And do magazine cartoons still have any power, or do they become just a New Yorker joke about not getting the jokes anymore?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, the New Yorker, that's kind of definitely magazine cartoons in that format have definitely had their day. But still in all, there are, in terms of if you were looking at a kind of book that's maybe the equivalent and more closely, say, tied in with what's been going on now, you've got a 50-year Mort Gerberg book that came out this past year, a retrospective of his work for The Realist and his other publications, such as The New Yorker and whatnot. So, yeah, if there was going to be an equivalent that's like, say, even maybe more close than Art Young, who would say fall more in political, then yeah, it would be Mort Gerber, just doing great stuff. And in terms of what's happening now, what with the whole dilution of the New Yorker cartoons, where it's gotten so, that whole separation, that whole word image separation, where they have, it's like, okay, you write the cartoon, you write the caption, that sort of thing. So it's like they're pretty much pointing out that there's no real solid connection there between the cartoon and the caption. If you can come up with 3 best every single week or other week or whatever it is. So in terms of people doing something different, that great concept that you had there of redoing the book, I really like that. I'm going to give that more thought. I would probably, so there was the Mort Gerber book. There would be, let's see. Yeah, well, of course, Pfeiffer's still around. God bless him. Stan Mack, another person who got his start back in the Village Voice with his real life stories. But in terms of what's being done now, I would say I would go to Mike Gerber. And either are you familiar with American Bystander?
Yeah.
It's
actually, I think I'm familiar with it because you've mentioned it to me before.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yes.
And have you seen, it's one cool thing about it is if you go to their website, they actually let you download a PDF of one of their old issues.
Right.
So it's like a sample is free. And they have such a wide mix. Basically, you pick it up and it's going to give off a New Yorker vibe, but it's much more cartoon oriented. In that sense, it's kind of like the love child of the New Yorker and the National Lampoon. And, if it was a threesome, probably Spy as well. And so they have the old New Yorker folks in there like Bob Bleckman and George Booth, M.K. Brown, as well as contemporary people, Roz Chast, Seymour Quast, Howard Cruz, and sorry again that he passed. Shari Flanagan, Rick Geary, for crying out loud, Peter Cooper, all these people are there. Mimi Pond, Ed Sorrell doing covers, that sort of thing. It's just really a spectacular place. It's a humor magazine.
Right, that's awesome.
It's heavy on the comics. So I would definitely, Mike Gerber was one of my guests in my class. He did a great job just talking about American Bystander. And since he was the one who, back in the early days, resurrected the Yale record, I'd have him talk about that as well. Maybe have him back as a guest speaker at another time. But in terms of, for magazine cartoons, that would be my lineup. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
That's fantastic and needs to be done, in my opinion. Talking about the changes in those cartoons, because it was such a historically important part of comics. And we know in my generation, we could name so many different artists, and it's hard for, regular people could name Arno and those, the Playboy cartoons, the dark sensibilities of some of that. And a lot of those people have passed in recent years. And I think it would be helpful to know that there are still artists like the ones you just mentioned that still can do a single panel gag in a magazine that's not just comic book related, but for mass audiences. Let's talk about another mass audience form of comics that is really, really being hit hard these days and is a vanishing breed, which is the editorial cartoons. When you did this, they were still a vibrant factor in terms of political discussion, and they've taken a real hit in recent years, haven't they?
Oh, yeah. Well, magazine cartoons, too, because newspapers and magazines have taken it. Daily newspapers, they're already digging the grave for those. Yeah, editorial cartoons, that's all part of that whole newspaper defunct sort of thing. Luckily, fortunately, first person that comes to mind is Ann Telnaeus, who's just still doing, the Washington Post is still running cartoons, and hers is just, in my evaluation, just top notch. And she herself, I met her. She's just a wonderful person. I'd love to have another excuse to get together with her again. And so then editorial cartoons. One person that I've had a couple of times at my class was Mr. Fish, Dwayne Booth. He's probably the most radical political cartoonist. He does stuff for The Nation and for a lot of the left-wing websites and such. And he's one of those take no prisoners sort of people who during the Obama administration hit him hard, and he's still doing it savagely to our present administrator. And he's just really smart, and he's extremely knowledgeable on the history of editorial cartoons. In fact, I wrote an article about a book that he did that really just takes it back to Hogarth, just does the entire history of radical cartoons. It's just absolutely wonderful. So those two would definitely find their way into that slot.
Have there been other periods of time where political editorial cartoonists are being fired from their papers for being political? Because that seems to be what's happened. There are some well-established editorial cartoonists that have been working for 20 years are being let go because they are critical of the current presidency.
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, the cartoonist who was writing for, basically was a leaning right in any event. This gave him there was a one step over the line that managed to give them an excuse to fire him. But that's a big part of history. I mean, there was one situation, speaking of The Nation, just to kind of flip the coin, Victor Navasky, the editor of Nation, who came up with a cartoon that actually was objected to internally. It was the cartoon of basically, okay, I got to make sure I don't get it confused with there were two very similar cartoons. And this one, do you know the one I'm talking about, where basically it's the globe, the world is on a bed and lying down and about to be fornicated upon
by Russia and the U.S., Soviet Union and the U.S.
And it was, I think that was the one, because there was another one that the Realist published. But in any event, the Russian,
I thought that was the Realist.
Yeah, that was the Realist. And
I saw that I saw that panel in your book, actually.
That was in the book. Yeah, that it's his turn now and then me again. Okay, so it was a David Levine cartoon of Henry Kissinger fucking the world. And it was that whole David Levine crosshatch style, just this wonderful rendering that actually was objected to by the women on staff of The Nation, because it basically and this is back when they would call such things political correctness. Now they have various other phrases. Like, I think woke has been used so much that's even gone. And so I'm unclear as to what the next phrase is being used. Yeah, I'm not getting the memos anymore. And actually, to his credit, Victor actually wound up running the cartoon of Kissinger screwing the world over the objections of the very strong objections of the staff. That'd be a great
I think that's an essential one, and just the notion of political correctness or Me Too or all the different things that make teaching hard today, and it makes cartoons and humor and stand-up comedy and everything else more difficult because of the new sensitivities for good and for bad.
Yes. Yeah, it would be terrific to talk about that. And it would also be a through line. I mean, this by far, the education of a comics artist, this isn't an update. This is a complete revise. This is volume 2 that we are now putting together, and that your listeners are actually hearing from the conception stage. Right. Yeah, only appropriate that we're talking about fornication and conception.
Right. And me and Jim are the two world powers, and you're our guest.
Ow!
It's your turn, Alex.
But before that, I have to say, not only am I enjoying it, but I also, when this book comes out, I'm saying when now rather than if. I haven't even lined up a publisher. But you help me out with that, right, guys? I am dedicating it to you two. The dedication is already there. Yeah, we got Alex and Jim right in front.
So I wanted to ask before we we move on to the adventure stuff. Single panel gags. We were talking about that, and editorial cartoons and political cartoons. Talk about single panel gag.
Yes.
I think that there is truly a mass need to consume single panel gags from this visual standpoint of there's a phrase and an image and then boom. And there is this need, I think, that humans have. It's a creative need that I think separates us from four-legged creatures and stuff. Is that
thus memes, right?
We have that need, but I think that in our current social media world, memes have largely are now replacing that as far as public mass consumption. People are getting that from memes that take no real artistic skill, of a slightly sociopathic phrases are being used, have replaced the public desire to go out and buy something of a higher and more creative etiquette. Do you feel like that's also contributing to a decline in single panel gags as a higher art form and on a commercial level?
Well, it's also kind of continuing along with that discussion we were having about the New Yorker. I mean, of course, many enter, but few are chosen with their caption contest. But, it's pretty much basically the same sort of thing, that whole my kid could do that sort of mentality. And it's pretty much, I can do that. Just the New Yorker isn't sharp enough to accept 700 contributions I gave in. So it's become something so easy to do, so slapdash, that it's become trivialized. That's a good point. And I think I'm going to have you contribute to that chapter on. Yeah,
I can totally, because I've analyzed this and I've thought about these memes have destructive influence on the arts. And I think it's just one of the many things where the internet, it kind of went wrong at some point.
Well, I hope that somebody comes up with a meme of me saying "fuck memes."
It'll have Baby Yoda saying it, and that'll make it all okay, though. For most.
There you go. So cute. Yeah.
It's so cute.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Okay. Political comics, because aside from what you were talking about earlier, there's not a lot of that. World War III hung in there for a long time, but it's not really something that it was once a pretty pronounced early in comics history. That was sort of a beginning of comics in Great Britain and here, and it doesn't really exist very much anymore, does it?
Well, coincidentally, my contribution from Peter Cooper is called Launching World War III, where basically he talks about how it really has been the longest running underground comic book in the universe. But in terms of the power of political cartoons, I have two words to say to you guys: Charlie Hebdo.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was the inspiration for me actually proposing my class, my history of comics class originally, because it's something I've always been thinking about. I mean, I've been teaching a history of graphic design class for the longest time, and that's been my passion all my professional life. But comics I've been researching since I was 2. And I've always been thinking about, well, I got to do a history of comics. And then those murders happened. And I wrote stories for print about it, my outrage. And I still felt I had to do something more. And I have been. And starting that class was one of them, which was one of the reasons that I only had one guest speaker in my first class after it started up. And that was Mr. Fish. He's one of the few editorial political cartoonists with any guts. That sort of thing. But yeah, in terms of the power of political cartoons, I mean, those people, they knew they were putting their lives on the line and they did it anyway. I mean, that kind of courage is just, it takes my breath away thinking about the guts of those people to do it. And I've got nothing but admiration for them. And I realize that sort of stuff, on a global scale, it's still going on. I mean, there's so much global censorship that comes along. You can read about in other countries every day, that there are people being put to death. So, for sure. That definitely is part of that political comics chapter. And it also speaks to the relevance of it in 2020 here.
So, Michael, before you mentioned Charlie Hebdo, I was going to bring up Doonesbury. And then once you brought that up, now I have to bring up Doonesbury again and Trudeau, but in a different context.
Yes.
So talk about what Trudeau said about the Charlie Hebdo and what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, just for starters, I've never liked Doonesbury. It's one of those things where he was doing a college comic strip back in college, and it never stopped looking like that. And it seems to be a point of pride with him. And so, I had that ongoing prejudice coming in since the first time I saw those college strips. And then that he would go and he would actually blame the victims as he did was just disgusting. It's just like one of those people that is, it's just, I'm just very sorry to hear that wasn't challenged more than it was. And I'd love to do a roundtable, if anything, not for this book, because it just, what he did was so fucked up in the first place that, it just, doesn't warrant that much attention. And I just like people to move on from there. So I wouldn't even want to include anything like that in the books.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very sad. And as you can see, it still makes me very angry. I've got no love for Doonesbury.
Right. And Doonesbury was a very important strip for me. But when Trudeau said what he did in terms of the Charlie Hebdo stuff, I thought that was a little on the, I hate to say cowardly side, but I don't think it was constructive. I thought it was not helpful to some degree. My other question, and then we're going to turn it over to Alex. During your LA Times experience, did you run into Ted Rall, speaking of politics and comics, at that point or not?
Let's see. I've interviewed Ted Rall about, it was a 2-part print feature that I did on Susie Cagle. He had his disagreements with her. She's doing political cartoons, kind of on the spot reportage along the lines of what Stan Mack was doing with Real Life Funny, where she would go into the Occupy movement camps and draw what she sees there. In any event, she and Ted had a differing of opinions, so I interviewed the both of them. But in terms of, so I gave him his voice there, and I respect Ted for putting out those books that he did a while back on alternative comics, where he really gave a forum to introduce so many of the unknown people. It's just, if you look up alternative comics, Ted Rall, you'll see the list of people he had in those volumes. And that is all for the better that he did that. I respect him for that. I know he had an issue with Art Spiegelman having his old boys club, or his School of Visual Arts club, and wouldn't let other people in. But that's something that that's one of those things where I'm a little more toned down. I think both sides have their point there. The fact that Art Spiegelman, when he's editing a publication, he is going to put in things from his perspective. It's like the best American cartoons of the year sort of thing. It's like, if you're the editor, that's what you do, and that sort of thing. But Rall also had other points about Spiegelman that definitely held its weight. So it's good to continue to keep that in mind. So I'm glad you brought it up, but it's in a nutshell.
So I'm a big fan of adventure comic strips, and I started out as a kid reading adventure comic books. And as far as comic strips that I really like the Raymond Flash Gordon. I've read all of Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates. I've read Wash Tubbs. I'm a big Wash Tubbs Captain Easy fan.
Roy Crane, the greatest.
Yeah, I've read all of Roy Crane's run on Wash Tubbs, and Scorchy Smith with the Noel Sickles run specifically. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about the comic strips. So what were comic strips that were important to you as a kid reading? You named a couple earlier, but tell the audience, what were comic strips that you thought, okay, wow, this is a good story, I'm going to keep reading this?
In the adventure genre that we're talking about here, or in the superhero sense?
Well, I would say probably more of the older strips of like 30s and 40s, not so much the superhero stuff, more just the adventure stuff, basically the progenitor stuff to the superhero stuff.
Yeah. And that goes back to those days for me as a kid in the 1950s where, I would pore over Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon and Hal Forster's Prince Valiant with the captions, that sort of thing. And of course, Dick Tracy
Chester
was definitely part of that whole action adventure, where I would be checking out the Crime Stoppers textbook all the time. It was in the 50s, it still had a bit of an edge. It wasn't quite as gritty as back in the early days when when his villains were really nice and fucked up.
Yeah. But also Dick Tracy was shooting those villains in the head, killing them too. The 30s run is incredible.
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely its heyday. But again, those comic strips were primers for me in terms of leading me back into finding out the good stuff.
Yeah. We would say that comic strips are an influence on the comic books, right? Eisner has stated as such that comic strips that he read, even Bob Kane, who's a little dubious in his histories, but he said that he was also influenced.
You're being so polite.
Yeah. That comic strips were a big influence on him as far as the early comic books. Has that been a little bit of a mini field of study for you in a sense of going back and looking at the 30s stuff and then looking at the early comics and contraposing some language or transition between the two media? How do you feel that the one media affected the other?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's why in my Trinity, I figured that
Will Eisner,
Will deserves the God the Father title, in the sense that, and I know we're going to get to Masters of American Comics later, but just to jump in there, he was pretty much the transition figure. The Masters of American Comics, as it was displayed here in Los Angeles, the Hammer Museum had the comic strips, and the Museum of Contemporary Art had the comic books. But still, Eisner was part of that comic books. It was like the comic strips ended with Peanuts. And speaking of Eisner as a progenitor, he paved the way. He also came up with whatever you want to call it, the factory system for producing, kind of taking away that individuality. So that now there's this whole list of credits for the mainstream comics. But to go back to those comic strips, you take a look at Dick Tracy was part of that, and they displayed so many of the good ones. Those, like we were talking about, the 1930s, just back, this was Chicago. This was the Depression. These were people who were trying to get money by, they were hungry.
And it was produced for the Chicago Tribune Syndicate as well. So
right. Yeah. Syndicate. Yeah, definitely. And in terms of our fandom overlapping here, it was like Milt Caniff was the person that they chose for action adventure. And for me, I can certainly understand it in terms of the kind of influence he had. It wasn't as dramatic as the Buzz Sawyer and Wash Tubbs, but I wouldn't have mind seeing, at least, if there was like a subdivision of that category, I would definitely have Roy Crane in there too. So you can see so much of what Roy Crane does now in comic books. There are plenty of people that still draw from his work.
I would even go on to say that Roy Crane had an ability to put adventure with comedy together. And I think that's actually a recipe for, like, a lot of the Marvel comics now. They throw adventure with comedy, and even the Marvel movies mix adventure and comedy. And I think Roy Crane is really important in the history of combining the two things to create a real effective entertainment.
Very good. Yeah. Those, and that artwork is to drool over, except you don't want to go putting liquids on duotone boards.
Eisner mentioned his influences. So Harriman with Crazy Cat, Seeger's Popeye, and then, as you mentioned already, Caniff's Terry and the Pirates. Were those strips that you've read, and were they important to you as well?
Yeah, it was in the early 1940s that Harriman stopped doing Crazy Cat, and justifiably so. It was not picked up by anybody else, because, I mean, seriously, who could ever? So again, this was a kind of a coming back sort of thing. But yeah, Popeye, there was the Sagendorf and of course the Max Fleischer cartoons and the rest of it. The animated cartoons, from Popeye to Betty Boop to Superman, they were definitely a strong part of that. But again, it was nice to go back and experience the whole Thimble Theater. Popeye and the rest of it.
That's interesting. This is a side question. This is like with Jim and the Music, is Pfeiffer's work on the Popeye movie and how that movie seemed to combine characters from the strip, but then it had almost like the Max Fleischer-esque almost kind of language about in a lot of the scenes. Did you feel like Pfeiffer's Popeye script, Altman direction, do you think that was an effective Popeye movie? I'm just curious, because you know a lot about a lot of the factors involved there.
Oh gosh, this is maybe one tangent that you might have to splice out, because I can't remember. I saw it once, and I don't remember being that
kind of forgettable, right? Kind of forgettable.
Forgettable, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. All the ingredients you'd think would be good, but it wasn't that great.
Yeah, it's like, look at Altman, look at Robin Williams, look at all the talent. And,
boo! I disagree.
Jim likes
much on this.
Oh, Alex, you troublemaker. Let's you and him fight.
The juxtaposition of the comic strip coming from, which is what Pfeiffer is doing in the script, and what Altman is doing in terms of the Fleischer cartoons and so forth,
that's what
creates a real fission, and that's interesting. But as somebody studying film, it is a fascinating film because of that contrast of ideas. Somebody that loves Popeye, watching those things play out like a debate about which one is more interesting, the cartoons or the comic strip. Does it fail as a movie a little bit? Yes. But is it an interesting thing to study as a film? So much so.
It is, yeah. Especially if you've read the strips and then you're familiar with the cartoons and you see the both elements of the movie. It's interesting from that perspective. I think just from a mass audience, it's tough for most people to grasp that stuff.
And not to curse, but fuck the mass audience. I care about what I like, and I like it. The mass audience wants to go see Titanic, and I'll leave it at that.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a good point. Does that bring us back to superheroes? And
nicely Martin, done, Michael.
You could do if you want to stick with the movie theme, I've got 2 words for you, Martin Scorsese.
There you go. There you go.
No, but let me ask a quick question, Alex, and I'll go back to you. But on the transition in the book from political comics to comic strips, and this carries over. You set it up, Michael, when you said that I asked about Art Young, and you said that was more editorial cartoons than magazine cartoons, even though he did both. It seems like as the flow of this book goes, there's always that could have been in chapter preceding it or the chapter following it. There's a lot of natural flow in this. So in comic strips, Alex is asking you about these specific ones, but the ones that I would think of would be Crockett Johnson's Barnaby and Walt Kelly's Pogo, and those which are political become very, very, and we mentioned Trudeau, obviously, but I know your feelings on that. But there are there's a lot of comic strips from editorial cartoonists or that are focused on politics. How do you decide when you're doing this which section something might belong in? And what are your thoughts? I assume that things like Pogo were of great interest to you.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. That was all part of that 1950s era with Pfeiffer and the rest of them, and it was done in such an accessible way. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Yeah, if you look at, say, in the comic strips section, the 4 people who contributed to that, it's not very political. For me, the interest in comic strips, one interest that's been revitalizing the field has just, got to do with the history. Of course, you take what Peter Maresca is doing with Sunday Press. It's like, that is what a godsend.
It is. So it recreates the size and the magnificence of the Sunday pages.
Yeah. Just the idea. I have a clear memory of my brother and me on our stomachs in the living room of our grandmother's house. You just open that spread and wow, plenty of real estate there. I mean, Peter Cooper wound up in political comics, and he does comic strips, as did David Rees with his Get Your War On. He wound up in political comics. So comic strips was the decision. It's like following political comics, you have comic strips. We've already just had 2 chapters with politics. Let's switch to comic strips, and then after that, kids and teens comics. So it was kind of that kind of toning down of that section.
Something for everybody.
One other thing, Michael, on that, which is we talk about political comics and politics, but all things are politics to some degree. And I think one area that wasn't done enough in terms of comic strip history, not in the book, but in actual comic strip history, is women as politics, race as politics, those things. And what Boondocks did is significant, but we have an opportunity, it seems like, in comic strips today to delve into diversity and different kinds of, I mean, we talk about Me Too as a negative, like awareness and wokeness as a negative, but there's also a great positive in what comic strips can do about sexual politics and otherness in different ways, and it not be so white male that it traditionally has been. And I wondered if that's something, a direction that also should be covered in a new version.
I agree with you to this, so much to the point of, and I'm going to have to talk with Steve Feller about this, but after hearing that and everything else that we've been talking about, it's fuck the dedication. I want The Education of Comics Artists Volume 2 to be edited by Mike, Alex, and Jim. Okay?
There you go. I like it.
Okay.
All right.
I'll do it.
Yeah. Okay.
It shall happen.
And that's what, actually, to go back to greasing you guys, this one of the reasons that comic book historians
is that a three-way reference again? What is that?
Yes, indeed. I knew you'd pick. One of the reasons that I think Comic Book Historians is the world's greatest podcast is because of the way that you folks put together, the people that you have on there. You put together shows that you can go back and listen to years later.
Right.
And it's, that's
and
actually
it's so
one of the things
we go for. Yeah, thank you.
And it's so fresh. It's so smart. You've got Chiarello, Fingeroth, Chaykin, Trina, the rest of them going back to Bob Bierbaum and Rick Marshall. I mean, this is really what Podcasts for the Ages should be. And I thank you for that.
Oh, that's nice.
Oh, thanks, Michael.
That means a lot to us. Thank you. We care about the effort. And that's why I think we resonate so much with your book, because I think we feel like your book does the similar thing in book form. And I think that's really marvelous.
And that'll be the kick. It's like when this book comes out, people will be able to go and be part of the inception of Education Volume 2.
There you go.
So, okay.
As far as the strips go, this is kind of a more global question, is the staying power of a good comic character. And it's tough because not everyone can draw a figure, and then everyone will continue to want to read about that character. So Bill Griffith wrote about, in one of your chapters, the Zippy the Pinhead and the staying power of a good comic character. It's hard to get a good grasp on that because all the characters are so diverse and different from each other. You know, Peanuts probably looks a little bit like Kathy, but then those look different from, let's say, a Flash Gordon character or some well-illustrated Prince Valiant. Is there a theme? Can it be put into a sentence, the staying power of a good comic character? How does that get created?
That would be great to put in the chapter of actually the creation of comics, which is also a chapter which you're going to be in charge of putting together. For me, it's always so much about form and content. I mean, yeah, sure, certainly there are comics that if they're generic enough, you can pass them on from one person to another. And, you brought up Pogo. Walt Kelly did it, and they tried to see if it could manage without him, but no, it couldn't. So there's a Pogo is something that is all of Walt Kelly, the way Crazy Cat is all of Harriman, and there's no way of passing that along, and I mean, with your example, who's going to be the inheritor of Zippy when Bill passes it along?
That's interesting. It sounds like it matters about the creator, and then their creation is like a lens to the audience, and if that creator is switched out, that lens, the quality of that lens and what people are getting out of it is changing. And so it sounds like the creator link to that character is really important. That's kind of what you're implying there.
Oh, yeah. For that sort of thing, and as I was also saying, it's about the subtleties and complexities. If you pretty much have a character that can be totally summed up in a sentence or so, then, you can pass it along fine. And there's no trouble. But if it's got those layers and that visual aesthetic to go with it, which is always important, always a component that needs to be considered, then the character lives and dies with the creator.
Yeah.
So it's a case by case basis.
I'm curious about that. If it is about the character itself, or luck in who comes on board afterwards. But I think of things like Alex Raymond books where they still work today. I mean, what the artist that came on Prince Valiant after, right up now to Yates, is still a joy to look at.
Those
it's
still
not
work.
And I think of Buck Rogers, and I think of Tarzan, and how many great artists have done Tarzan. Whereas you think of some comics, like the ones we're talking about, or as simple as, or seemingly simple as Charles Schultz. Peanuts could not be done by anybody else.
Yeah, it seems like adventure is easier to transition between different people, but that's interesting. But the comedic cartoon, that's harder.
In terms of longevity, by being simplistic, that has lasted since the late 1940s. I have one word for you, Archie.
Yeah, there you go. That's continuing for sure.
And they're fucking around with it. It's now Archie is more like the Goodman Beaver parody of Archie.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, that's actually true.
Yeah. So to transition, and actually the staying power character connected to the creator, let's use that to transition to comics. Steve Gerber was kind of like that with Howard the Duck, because it just, Howard is not the same without Steve Gerber. And that leads me to comic books now. So as far as your comic book section, there's some interesting creators that have chapters in your book. So Jim Steranko, obviously, who I'm a big fan of, and we've had on the show before. There are two things he kind of writes, and I think he kind of looks at it that way, but it also just comes down to the way the two parts that comes into a comic is, first, the writing of the comic. He mentions the pulp precursors to comics in there, like how the Shadow was a precursor to Batman, and how he read a lot of pulps, and pulps were a huge influence on him. And then from the visual of the comic, his big influence was cinema, putting cinema into his comics and putting those camera angles and the choreography panel by panel. So it seems like pulps and cinema, writing and the art of the comic, it seems like that's Jim Steranko's kind of thing. When you read his Captain America and Nick Fury and then his later graphic novels, what was your impression of Jim Steranko's contribution to comic books and the comic medium graphic novels? What's your impression of Jim Steranko?
Well, certainly his contribution started out with his volumes 1 and 2 of his history, where he got into, as you were saying, all those roots with the Shadow, the Spider, and the rest of it, which is truly the origin story of superheroes from that sensibility, from the literary sensibility. And from the visual sensibility. When I first saw it, it was impressive. But then it was one of those things where I was going, oh yeah, I see what he's doing. This was this was post Batman TV show. And, it was okay, comics, pop art and that kind of stuff. And so you look at his stuff and you go, okay, there's the DeCurico and there's the Dali. And it would have been nice if it was transformed more, that if he had made it his own. And while it isn't just straight appropriation, it isn't a cut and paste job. It's with the clocks and the columns, the rest of it, it's so close that, okay, if this is meant to evoke otherworldly for anybody with a basic knowledge of surrealism, no, you're just sending the mind off in another direction. That said, he is a master of composition, of lighting, the wonderful stuff that he's done. You think of Guido Crepak's, the kind of chiaroscuro, Alex Toth and the rest of it. And, it's brilliant. But when you ask me specifically about the Captain America stuff that people go and point to right away, it's, that kind of came and went. That for me didn't have the sustaining power that the rest of his small body of work did.
Right. Like Chandler, and then he did that Outland, for Heavy Metal magazine? Outland.
He did the comic scene that evolved into media scene.
Right. I have a lot of those,
There's stuff, and he actually, my interview with him lasted twice as long as what appeared. I mean, half of it is on the cutting room floor, so he's extremely knowledgeable and really fascinating about what he had to say. But again, it was a space limitation. He had, I think, pretty much the longest piece in the book, and it could have been twice as long.
Yeah.
And
I think Michael that he kind of, and this may be in keeping with what you're saying, I think he's sort of Lichtenstein's surrealism. He just takes the base thing from Dolly and puts it there in comics rather than understanding philosophically what it is, the way that
exactly
that other people do.
Well put.
When someone like Alan Moore wants to do what anarchy is, he understands it intellectually, and you can see it in every page that he's capturing the politics of an anarchist. When Steranko is doing the notion of a surrealist, he's just copying, and it's not in a swipe way, but he's just emulating what he sees on the page without getting it philosophically, is what I would say.
But what I would say is one of the main visual standouts of his Nick Fury run is its James Bond movies were a huge part of the Nick Fury. And I think if you were to look at the stuff coming out of Marvel in the late 60s, it's fun Silver Age stuff. But I would say that the stuff he did specifically stands out, though, in that he still punched through a lot of what was expected of a Marvel artist by Stan. I think he was still able to punch through that and still make a statement when everyone else was like, okay, I'll just draw it like Kirby. I think that Steranko still punched through in a way where under the strict vision of what Marvel was supposed to look like, he was still able to go in and make a statement, especially with some of that horror stuff and the romance comic he did. He still was able to do things that other people couldn't at that time in the late 60s when certain things were expected of artists and writers.
Absolutely. Right. My only criticism was his clocks and what he's doing and being credited as a surrealist or anything like that. I think that's more just an emulator. But in terms of Kirby and that stuff, you compare what he was doing quickly to what Barry Smith was doing, and it's like he's much better at taking Kirby. Barry Smith learns how to steal from other artists instead and not Kirby, and that's how he becomes famous.
But of course, that's pre-Conan Barry Smith, right? I mean, his Conan.
No, in fact, he steals from Conan. I mean, on Conan completely, but he's stealing from other master artists, not Dolly. Obviously.
I see what you're saying.
His style is not an original style; it's an incorporated style from fine arts.
Right. The illustrative style that it evolves to is more of a fine arts kind of style. I see what you're saying. Okay. All right. That's good.
Which is cool.
Which is still cool. Yeah, for a Marvel comic, of course. The great discussion, guys, by the way. I mean, that was stimulating. I don't know. Did you feel that? Did you feel that? Do I need a cigarette? Do we need cigarettes?
I could use some more grease.
We need more grease. Yeah, let's keep it coming. Let's get more grease. Sure.
Okay, I think this conversation is certainly animated, but it's also getting X-rated.
There you go.
To drop a Crumb reference or a Bakshi reference, actually. So, and if you want to wrap that up with a personal recommendation that I have for, what I'd probably, I guess if push comes to shove and people were asking me, what's your favorite comics book of the past year, I'd have to say it's a biography of Andy Warhol. It's a 560-page biography of Andy Warhol done in a multiplicity of cartoon styles.
Oh, cool.
And it is just the most incredible work. If you have either of you heard about it?
No, I haven't.
No.
Oh, okay. It's originally published in Germany, and it's just, in terms of picking up styles, it is so hysterical. It's like every single one of those nearly 600 pages is just a masterwork in creativity. And it's just, it's you want to talk about people being able to emulate styles with a complete understanding of what they can do and what they should do. Definitely look up Andy, A Factual Fairy Tale, which is basically, it's the life and times of Andy Warhol, because it does get into fantasy, and it's put out by, Typex. That's one of my recommendations just to wrap up the pop art.
The pop art section, yeah. Just two more questions before we move on to the graphic novel section Jim's going to do. Bill Sienkiewicz, I feel like he impresses me as well as his own artist, just as Steranko impresses me as his own artist. It's interesting because it seems like he has that early phase where he was trained with Neil Adams, and there was this talk of, especially during the early Moon Knights, of him being a bit of a Neil Adams clone. But then he evolves and ascends into his own expressive art form. And you see a lot of various influences in it, like Gustav Klimt and other people. What's your impression of Bill Sienkiewicz's contribution to comics and his stance of being a true comics and fine artist? He kind of combines the two things. What's your impression?
My impression is extreme respect. I think it's like, as a kid, I admired Harvey Kurtzman just so much, and as someone who reached adulthood and discovered Bill Sienkiewicz, his work in general and stray posters in particular, it's like he is on the top of that list in terms of action adventure heroism. He is a hero to me in terms of how he's expanded. He's taken the stuff that have roots in Baron's story,
right,
who I also interviewed, and he combines it with what Dave McKean was doing also,
right.
And another person who was working both sides of the divide. Well,
right. That's the Sandman covers, and that's fine art and comic art together. Yeah,
right. Yeah, not so much working different sides, but basically knocking down the walls.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm so happy that he's came to my class to talk, and I'm also happy that in a couple of months that he and I are actually going to be sharing a panel at the San Diego Comic Fest. Excited about that. And one last thing too, there are also in that chapter is David Mack, and another recommendation, if you haven't seen Cover, the book that was written in a 6-issue series and is just recently, last year, been put into a paperback, written by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by David Mack, who really gets back to his kabuki roots and does something, to me, and in so many ways is even more spectacular than kabuki. Have you seen Cover, either of you?
I have.
Yes. I have a slight allergy to Bendis, all things Bendis.
Oh, okay.
I liked his Avengers, and I loved his Daredevil. But
I loved his Daredevil. The reason I don't like him is because of his Avengers, but that's another conversation.
There you go.
Okay.
But what I really want to have, because I hate what he did with the Avengers so much, and I'm not reading his Superman.
There you go. The protest continues.
But I like it. I haven't read an issue, but I like it a lot more than I do the John Byrne Superman. I can say that.
Okay, well, there you go. See, there's a silver lining, Jim. There's a silver lining.
Does it matter that Cover is not superheroes?
Yes, and I like some of it. I read Power. I mean, I don't hate all things Bendis. I don't like Bendis working in mainstream comics all that much. I think he's lazy about that. This I will try.
Oh, good. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
I think I'm good. So, Jim, why don't you go with the alternative comics and graphic novels now?
So, alternative comics. What is the definition of it?
I would think that alternative comics, the definition in most people's minds, if they even think of anything these days, is probably Love and Rockets. And so when we redo this book, I wouldn't use the word alternative. I think it's pretty much had its day. It would, it would be something independent comics.
There you go.
Pops up. So that would be how that would be updated, and just really, thinking in terms of the independent press, basically.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting, because Chaykin has very clear definitions of those two things and does not count them as the same thing at all. Are you coming from that kind of position on that?
Oh, he has a difference between alternative and independent?
Yeah.
Okay, no, we're not disagreeing at all in the sense that basically what I'm saying is alternative is, as a word that means anything significant, is pretty much dead and buried. So just let's get rid of it. Let's not dance on the head of that pin. Call it independent at this point and move on from there.
Because I think alternative implies that it's not mainstream, or it's not for most people, and maybe by saying independent, maybe that's better in a sense that it's just coming from a smaller publisher, and it's open for anyone to read it, basically, something like that.
Yeah.
Because talking about Love and Rockets or Cerebus or those alternative comics that had their roots in underground comics but were not underground comics, that was one direction. But then there was also First Publishing and Eclipse and things where they were doing things that were independent and that they weren't the main two. I think they're both words that still have some merit. I get what you're saying about alternative comics, though. And talking about alternative comics, in your book, you're talking about people like Gary Panter and things, and not whether it's Love and Rockets or Cerebus or things that came out in the 80s as alternate comics that kind of changed the direction to some degree in terms of how they were marketed, the retail, the sales of them, and all of those things that are complicated. The question I would have, first question I would have is, historically speaking, what do you think the impact of Karen Berger as an editor and Vertigo Comics in general had on comic book history?
Yeah, great question, and certainly a great heritage, because the amount of people that she opened things up to, the amount of focus, her coming from the literary rather than the comics geek world, was really a boon. And so much of it up until that point was people who were, once upon a time, I was a snot-nosed comics geek putting out fanzines, and you know, now I'm the editor of a major metropolitan comics company. So her independence and what she did there was broaden the horizons, and really pretty much you could say that she was one of the people who made the term alternative comics irrelevant. And not to put it in the past tense, because she's still doing good stuff with Berger Books. Luckily, she's continuing there. It's pretty much giving that sensibility that, yeah, like, you know, fuck the formula. Let's do this, you know, let's try that. And yeah, it's going to continue. What she's done, the legacy of Vertigo is going to continue still for quite some time. So
yes,
yeah, definitely. So
even though it's gone, in my mind, if Vertigo hadn't come along and the writers that were brought in to work there, going from Moore to Morrison and so forth, I think comics would have lost me during that period.
Okay.
Alex would be here because he's younger and was reading the Marvel books and things and joyfully experiencing Tom DeFalco and so forth. But
which I was.
I mean that I was reading Lascaux cave painting cartoons.
There you go.
But for me, in law school, I don't know if I would have made it if not for Vertigo, and then of course obviously the year of 86 and all of the things that came with that, Watchmen and so forth. But that made a difference for people who mainly traveled in mainstream comics but were caught by the intellectualism of what Berger brought to that, I think. So when I think of alternative comics, I just add a pitch for that. Even though it's mainstream DC as the publisher, it was certainly alternative in its definition.
Right, and its reach was such an important part of the process. Kudos to DC for doing that.
And that's Levitt's hiring Karen as his assistant, and then he saw a lot of talent and wanted her to have her own brand at DC. So that was, I think, Levitt's helped facilitate that line of comics, with Karen Berger being obviously the creative engineer of the whole thing.
Yes. So what would you say in terms of this section, besides changing the title, what would you bring aboard currently? And one question I would have is, where does Kirkman fall into this in terms of, no one's been more successful in the history of comics in terms of money probably than he has with Walking Dead and so forth. Are those alternative comics, or did he just create his own mainstream comic, and that's where it should be discussed in the previous chapter on adventure and so forth? And maybe, does alternate comics or independent comics now mean pitching toward the movie industry and TV industry?
Well, that's become,
yes.
That's become an essential, but yeah, there's no way of separating that again. For me, I would think in terms of how would you approach a chapter called independent comics, I think one thing I'd like to do that isn't done that much in the first volume of the book is to go to the editors, go to D&Q, go to Eric at Fantagraphics, talk to even, like Scott at IDW and get their input rather than say, keep it narrow focused to the point of talking about, say, Walking Dead in specific, do it in wider brushstrokes. I think that kind of expanse would be more useful to the reader in the sense of hearing it from the publisher, and the editor would really be covering a lot of important points that you wouldn't get as immediately with just kind of breaking it up into individual people. You know what I mean? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably right. Let's talk about graphic novels section for a minute, because when I read your book on that, that's where it seemed to me that was one of the most personal areas for you in talking, because your field of graphic design really came into prominence with the people that you selected, with the Chip Kids, obviously, and the Chris Wares, with Kim Deitch, and Rick Garry, that the focus was so much on, with all of those people, the visual design of the project that they're working on. I'd like you to talk about that for a minute or two.
In addition to people like the ones you just mentioned, Spiegelman and also Satrapi, I also wanted to include at least one person who wasn't part of who you would first think of in terms of graphic novels, which is Ho-Che Anderson, who was doing these interesting bits of work. He wound up with the King biography, and he was doing so much else, but it was one of those people didn't really know about him. So one of the things that I wanted to do in the book was, let's bring in Peter Blegvad, who did Leviathan, and who readers might be going, what? Well, everything else has been good, so let's see what they have to say. So definitely you pinned it on me in terms of what I was trying to do, coming at graphic novels from a graphic design. I mean, the fact that I'm even teaching a history of graphic novels, for me, it's a subdivision of the class I'm also teaching at my other school, History of Design, because graphic novels, comics, are for me a subdivision, that sort of thing, and it's something that doesn't go anywhere near significantly recognized as much. And this is something that actually, when I was listening to Howard Chaykin talk just yesterday at the Long Beach Comic Expo, he was saying what's fucked up about people who are looking at comics, reading comics, critiquing comics, is they don't know that it's form and content. He gets shit for Black Kiss. He gets shit for the Divided States of Hysteria, because people are reading what it says and not taking the form into consideration. Basically, it's without context. And without context, they're beating him up and they're calling him a right-winger for no good reason at all. And so much of the study of comics and graphic novels leaps over into the academic world. So many of the courses I know we're going to be getting around to talking about education as well, but so many of the courses in history of comics and graphic novels are coming from that viewpoint. They're coming out of the academic sphere, where people are, we got to start a comics history class. Let's get somebody from the English department. Let's get someone who knows their literature. And so for me to talk about graphic novels without including both halves of that phrase, it was what Chaykin was saying. It's content without context. Yes, it was personal for me. And to take that even further, it's like in terms of experimentation, and maybe I'm anticipating your next question, which would be who to think about when it comes to including graphic novels next time around. Does that sound like something?
That would definitely be part of it.
Okay, I would say that I would include Seymour Quast, who, when he was in his 80s, decided to become a graphic novelist. Are you familiar with Seymour?
No.
Okay. The graphic design history there is he and Milton Glaser started Pushpin Studios in the late 50s. And basically they were coming out of a comics sensibility. In fact, Milton Glaser, who you're familiar with, most known for the Bob Dylan poster, the profile, and the I Heart New York symbol, that whole graphic design, that was coming. He talks about how he was influenced, and he was saying just about all those graphic designers from his era, from his generation, were coming out of reading Prince Valiant and the Sunday Funnies. And so Seymour Quast has always had a very cartoony sensibility about him. And he was in his 80s, I believe, when he decided to start doing graphic novelizations of classics like Canterbury Tales, Dante's Divine Comedy. And he was doing a magnificent job. He did like 3 of those, and he's still at work on it. He just came out with another book that was released just like a month ago. This is Elvis, a biography of Elvis Presley that he worked on with Stephen Brower. This is one of those things where for Steve Heller and me, coming from that graphic design sensibility, so much of that reflected, there was that thread throughout, not just graphic novels, but through the whole book, that whole realization that there's more to comics than what the typical comics readers go to. For me, it's like, yeah, I'm delighted to, read the best of the year lists in comics, but so much of what they include are things that they're not aware of that they should be. So this was kind of a secret agenda, unspoken. Right. We never really talked about it that Steve and I was doing. So that's all I have to say about graphic novels. What do you think? Okay. What do you think? What do you think?
No, we'll have to have a further conversation on that subject, because I would like to talk to you about, because of graphic design, I'd like for you to talk about the debate about whether you have to be a good artist and whether you have to be, in order to make a good graphic novel, how important the design is or isn't to that. But I think we need to move on. But keep that in mind for a section in the book, because I would like to have that covered.
Okay. That's delightful. All right. We will do that. And tell him Groucho sent you. Okay.
All right. So, Michael, let's talk about the comics profession, the business of comics, the creation of comics. So explain what you wanted to accomplish in these 2 sections of your book. And I think it's great, because I think a lot of books that talk about comics, they almost focus on the pictures or sometimes the narrative. But I love that you really put some of the bones and meat of actually creating and the business of the comics. What were you wanting to accomplish with these 2 sections?
Well, it's actually, all of these are subsections underneath a larger section, and right. It's like section, 4 was the comics profession. And so this is like, this is kind of getting to that left side of the brain sort of thing. It's like, okay, here's some practical tips kind of thing. It's fun to talk about the creativity, but let's get down to some brass tacks in the sense that, and starting again from the very beginning with Heidi McDonald talking about Comic-Cons, which, again, anyone picking up the book who's familiar with comics, she's not saying anything new to them, but still it's an introduction. It's kind of a basics and a primer. And then it just, basically builds on that, going to popularizing the comics, which business and creation, there's overlap there too, like you were talking about, other overlap between right. comic strips and politics. That whole, to what extent is coming up with a memorable character, how much of that belongs to creation and how much is business? And we can certainly finesse that and refine it and figure out how to present it in both. In terms of the update, the business of comics now would have to include finding out who've been the most successful right. Comics creators who got their start on Kickstarter, right?
Right. There you go. That's a whole new thing that wasn't there in such full force in the early 2000s.
Yeah, to find, even Michael Gerber's American Bystander, that got its Kickstarter start. And, right. I love it so much that when he said, now that we've got it started, we're going to Patreon. I never had a Patreon membership, and I just signed up right then. It's like,
right. That's yes, your contribution.
I want this to come to me forever.
Right. Internet definitely changed that.
Yeah.
There are some chapters I really enjoyed because you can't really get some of these people anymore. So Joe Kuber, he talked about the school, the dedication, the commitment, and the practice it takes, the hours of physical practice and work it takes to be good at drawing comics and the construction of comics. What I like about that is it's not like you can get Joe Kuber to write an update on that, but you're able to get a piece of this guy in your book. And I think that was really impressive. And I think and I think a lot of readers would be surprised that it takes a lot of actual hard practice to be good at drawing comics. I felt like that chapter discussed that really well.
Yeah, and he was wonderful to talk to. He was just very generous with his information, and yeah, I miss him. That was a good interview. I really enjoyed doing that.
Then I really liked Craig Yo's chapter. He has a great, it's almost like a rock and roll love letter to the great cartoonists from Topher to Wally Wood. And then there's also some other cool chapters. You got Trina Robbins and her summary of women in comics, which I think is really important. One, to show the women in comics discussion as it's a to make it a more complete book, which you did, but also that she's written so many books on it that it's nice to get that quick summary to get people interested and getting other Trina Robbins works and really expanding that discussion.
Oh, I was just going to say, in the way she talks about, she's got books out talking about the actual women creator of comics, but here she's talking about Archie comics. She's talking about why Patsy Walker is important and going to sock hops, and even touching on Simon and Kirby's Young Romance. It's like, and getting it from her perspective. She is so wonderful. She's smart in so many ways. But I don't have to tell you that you had that great interview with her. So you know.
Oh yeah. She's a very strong personality. She in the Jedi world would be on that Yoda level of comics history, so to speak. So now,
just don't put her in a fucking meme.
There you go. Baby Yoda guacamole, anybody. So as far as Teal Triggs, there was a great discussion of girl comics, Bill Wagon's Katie Keene fashions, etc. I'm just impressed that you were able to, not everyone thinks of those aspects of comic books, but this, in the creation of comics and in that whole profession of comics, to throw that stuff in there, I thought that was really smart. This really needs to be there could be a whole class on this book you co-edited and created.
Oh yeah, I imagine I'm doing sections of a couple of chapters in my class, but
exactly.
That would be there. So there's actually a whole university to be set up based on this book, right?
And you could actually just make a couple subsections into their own classes. I mean, it's vast. It's probably not meant to read through in one go, but to go refer to it. But I did. And I felt transformed after.
Really?
And you're part of that, so I appreciate it.
I was mentioning in jest about turning the book into a university. I mean, the whole teaching comics idea, one of the things I hope to talk about with Jim is the fact that you now can get master's degrees.
Oh, yeah.
I agree about the teaching on that. And also I would add that people are using in other courses are using comic materials, things like March, more and more. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating period for that, with a lot more acceptance, but also a lot more resistance along the lines that we talked about previously in terms of what is woke or what is acceptable or what is offensive to different students, and also politically where it fits in with the mind meld that is current university politics. It's hard. Let's talk about education in that context, but also what about you as a teacher? And we're going to kind of phase out of the book at this point into what your own experiences are, where you're teaching, what you're doing, and what your experiences are with students at this point.
Yeah, well, in terms of transitioning, speaking of teaching, it's like that was one of the last chapters was about teaching comics, and to redo that in 2020, we would work on doing research on the fact that you can now get master's degrees in comics, which just didn't exist in 2005. You now have places like the California College of the Arts. And of course, there's James Sturm's Center for Cartoon Studies. So you want to bring that in as well. And it's worldwide, too. You've got the University of Dundee in Scotland. That's wonderful. It was one of those things where, just to continue along with what you were talking in the politics of teaching it in this day and age, as I said, the inspiration for me to finally get off my ass and propose a comics history class came out of the Charlie Hebdo. And it was one of those things where, so this is 2015, okay? So I asked the head of the department who okayed it. Fortunately, just like with relative ease, I was happy to say. And right off the bat, I said, okay, so in my syllabus, am I going to need to put a trigger warning? And she was, it was like, scoffed and waved her hand. It's like, you know how to teach. Fuck that shit, basically, is what she was saying. it was like, so you know how to handle it, because it's like, this is even pre all the other stuff that's going on now. And so, yeah, I pretty much know how to communicate with the students. There are certain sensitive areas. There are, well, it's now history of comics and animation. And yeah, you're going to talk about racism in comics from Little Nemo to Bob Crumb, and animation just like all over the place from Little Nemo to whenever. So it's like, basically I tell the students, I will say to the students, okay, here's what I'm going to show you. Here's whatever it might be, pictures of Muhammad. I usually, when I announce that I'm going to be showing pictures that certain people are offended by, like the Muhammad cartoons, right, I usually like to, at that time, have a slide on the screen, a picture of Magritte's "This Is Not a Pipe." So to give it that kind of context. Or I could put the Bob Crumb quote, "It's only lines on paper, folks." That sort of thing. But still, I can understand it. I can empathize with it. And it's like, you go into stuff that we all have taken for granted. We got to consider, if we're talking about 1950s horror comics, the treatment of women there is, it's rough. And so I'm pretty much happy to be a part of that. I'm also pretty much happy that nobody's telling me that I have to do anything, that I have to follow these rules or anything like that. It's just like, okay, I respect the kids. I'm conscious of what's going on there. I take care of it. And usually it's like, whatever, take a 45-minute break. And it's not going to affect your grade at all. I completely understand. So in answer to your question, there's no problem there.
Okay. Maybe just for a minute, talk about some of the guests that you've had come to your class.
Oh, well, some I've already mentioned. I mentioned Michael Gerber came to talk about his American Bystander. And in the course of that, he also talked about the cartoons, focusing on the cartoons. And of course, he was familiar with the New Yorker. So we got into that. And I'd really like to have him back to talk about his time in the 80s, where he resurrected the Yale Record, which was basically Yale's equivalent of the Harvard Lampoon. And he made the point that when it came to satirical college magazines, Harvard Lampoon's specialty was putting out the writers, and the Yale Record specialty was putting out the artists. And so I'm going to have him come back and talk about that. But yeah, Howard Chaykin came to my class and just enthralled everybody. What I had done was I had prepared a slideshow, because it's against my teaching religion to, if I'm teaching a history of design, comics, animation class, to not have at least one image on the screen at any given time. So basically what I did was I did a Q&A with him, and I structured the questions and coordinated them with the slideshow. And so Howard was facing the audience, he was talking, and as I was asking him questions about this and that, flag, black kiss, whatever, I would have the slides in the background. The students could see it, but Howard wasn't even aware of it, and it didn't matter, that sort of thing. So that was cool. And he enjoyed it so much that he and Bill were at one point talking about putting on a show together, Bill Sienkiewicz. Then the question came up. Bill said, well, where would be a venue for this? And and Howard said, Mike Dooley's class?
There you go.
And so in last semester, they came and they just chatted up. We had to move to a larger room than my classroom. Because the crowds were, the news got out on Facebook, and people were writing on Facebook, I'd kill to be there. And it's like,
that's awesome.
Yeah, there were so many. There were my students, of course, and they were the main core and the focus, obviously, so that these guys weren't preaching to the choir, because the main point is all about the students, as it is always with all these guest speakers. But still in all, there were people who were able to bring up other aspects, talk about Black Hawk or whatever, and that sort of thing. And like I say, with the slides, I had that. So that worked out great. I've had Scott Shaw come a couple of times, and it's always different too. It's like the first time he came, he talked about his own work, and the second time it's like, well, I don't want to. So I said, talk about your influences. And so he put together a slideshow of the 13 most important people in his career, that sort of thing. And so I already mentioned Mr. Fish, plenty of other. One thing just recently that happened that it wasn't even planned. I had Bill Morrison as a guest. You know, he was editor of Mad at the end, and he had also just recently came out with a Yellow Submarine graphic novel that he put together. And it was like, we were talking about what to talk about. And I said, well, The Simpsons is also an end of an era. Come talk about The Simpsons. And so he came, he talked about The Simpsons. He had a slideshow. As usual, he did a great professional job. And he brought along 6 guests.
Wow.
And one of the guests was Sergio.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Like,
Aragonis. That's great.
Whoa. Yeah. Come on. You know, it's great. You know, so I can go on. And, you know, I haven't even talked about all the people in animation as well. But just in terms of just what's coming up, I've got another return engagement from a group of live performers called the Captured Oral Fantasy Theater, who perform regularly at Comic-Con and various other venues. They are local. They've put on a show at my class, and coming up is going to be on Valentine's Day. They are going to do EC Comics love stories.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And from all the genres, including crime, suspense, horror, sci-fi, and the rest of it.
Beautiful.
So
that's great. You really approach your classes with creativity and passion. It sounds like you approach your classes as its own art form in a way. Oh,
well, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that compliment. And they're watching a radio play because this theater troupe brings their own vintage 1930s microphones, and they have a table set up for sound effects and everything like that. It's just incredible. And it was like last time they did one presentation, and it was like, I'd like to have you back. And Ben, who heads it up, said, oh, what would you like us to do? And I said, you available in early February? How about EC Comics love stories? And he was like, yeah, that sounds like fun. So they did that. They're putting that together even as we speak. And then I have another one just to talk briefly about animation. There's a documentary feature on the Spike and Mike's Sick and Twisted Animation Festival that started the careers of I like that. Yes. Of a whole lot of people. And in the documentary, they've got among the talking heads are Will Vinton, Bill Stout, Weird Al, Bruno Bozzetto from Allegro Non Troppo, Bob Kurtz, Marv Newland from Bambi Meets Godzilla. Anyway, so the director is coming. She's going to screen this film, which is actually set up to premiere at the Slam Dance Festival. So it's just like breaking out now. And she's going to come along, and she said she's going to bring along some of the local people who were in the film to talk about it. So that's fun. I'll stop there, but that's like 2 of the people from this coming semester that I'm really excited about. Or 2, it's actually 2 groups, an 8-person theater group and a 4, 6, 8-person screening of Spike and Mike's film. Anyway, that's awesome. Speakers.
I love great set of guests, great instruction, and I love the passion. You have such great passion for this. It's really great.
And you were talking about the EC and stuff. I know you have a bunch of things, Comic Fest and other activities, but let's limit it to the one that you are most excited about coming up at WonderCon. And please, and I don't know anything about it. Tell me about what that one is.
Bullshit. Yes, it just so happens that among the presentations that I'm giving in 2020 is basically it's what would you call it? Seduction of the 1950s comics. I'm doing a panel with Sydney Phillips. She's an expert on romance comics of the 1950s. And then another guy, God, I forget what the hell is it. Let me look at, Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson is also going to be doing something on EC Comics. And this Jim Thompson guy, he's so much of an expert that I've been putting together a flyer for my EC Comics love story for my class that I've been going to him for advice, and he has gotten me some great panels that I'm going to be including in the flyer, in the poster.
Nice.
And I'm going to be talking about another aspect of the 1950s comics.
So anybody that's going to be at WonderCon, please come see us. We're going to be presenting a panel around the theme of seduction, and it should be in comics of that 1950s era, and it should be great fun.
It will be.
So that's WonderCon. I want to talk about Comic-Con for a minute. And what your role is going to be in that. I'm just going to say the word Eisners, and then you're going to tell us what you are and what you can say without talking too much about the subject, because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But
and the winners will be, but I'll have to kill all your listeners first. No, it's nothing like that. The Eisner Awards, as usual, will be given on Friday, July 24th, just a couple of days after Jackie Estrada put up the announcement saying that it's time to submit for artists, publishers, comics people to submit their entries in the 30-something categories. And with those entries, I and 5 other people are judges, and I'm very honored to have been chosen as one, and I'm among a great group, a fantastic group, one of whom I knew already, Jamie Koval. He's definitely into comics history. He's been writing about comics history for about 25 years. And anybody at Comic-Con has probably seen him, because at the panels, he's the guy that goes up with a tape recorder to the dais and asks to be recorded. And he actually, for the past, I think since like past 15 years, he's been posting not only San Diego Comic-Con, but all sorts of panels and whatever Comic-Con he can get to. And post them online at thecomicbooks.com.
Exactly.
So definitely worth checking out.
Really nice fellow too.
He is indeed. Oh yeah, he's a sweetheart. And the others I'm looking forward to meeting with, corresponding, but as it mentions in the official announcement that's been posted, we judges will be meeting in San Diego in late March and actually be doing the real heavy lifting. Right now we're doing a whole lot of prep. Anyway, the other 4 are Martha Koenig, Alex Gresham, Simon Jimenez, and Laura O'Mara. And dealing with them electronically has been nothing short of a delight. I can't imagine a better group of judges that I'd like to be with. And they all are coming from such different perspectives, and they all have smart attitudes about comics in different ways than me. So I am so looking to not only get to knowing them, but also getting enlightened to their perspective. It's just going to be a blast as far as I'm concerned. So I'm really looking to what is basically in reality and literally in the literal sense of the term, a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Oh yeah. So, this is a fun, huge milestone and well deserved. You've contributed a lot in various forms, just to graphic design, analysis, commentary, your classroom, your students. You're a historian, you're an artist. We're really impressed with your work, and we're really glad that you listen to our podcast as well. And really,
to be a part of it as well.
Well, thank you. And honestly, you being an Eisner judge is well deserved. I congratulate you for your life achievements as well as your future achievements, and this is one of them.
Your place in comics history will be cemented forever if you could move Alex and I from the bleachers at the Eisners over to the table section.
There you go. Exactly.
I think the judges have a certain amount of pull, but when it comes to seating, I don't know. I'll probably have to bring a folding chair myself. But the good news about it is when the 3 of us actually get The Education of a Comics Artist Volume 2 published, then I will have an inside connection to the Eisner Awards.
There you go.
Think about that.
I'm ready to go.
I'm not saying anything, but you know.
No problem. My finger's on my nose. Yes.
To God's ear.
To God's ears, yes. So this has been a fun episode of the Comic Book Historians podcast with Alex Rand and Jim Thompson. We've really enjoyed Michael Dooley's work for a long time now. We've actually, through a process just through online, we've actually become friends, and we've hung out in person. We're privileged to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks to the both of you.